Okay, here we go. So we're doing 3 sets of notes right now. 5.3 is on a topic called preconditions, which is pretty much what it says. A precondition is something that has to be true before something happens. So, and you'll get some questions on the AP test potentially that say, which of the following would be a precondition for this method to operate correctly? And I could give you an example from, here's a good example. Following code returns the double result of 2 integers being divided. We could say a precondition is that the b integer not be 0, right? Because this code would just crash if b was 0. You're not allowed to divide by 0. Yes?
I divided by 0 in the warm-up, but it was giving me infinity.
NaN, or yeah, sometimes it does that. Yeah, so it didn't crash in your case, but it's not giving you a valid result, you know. Yeah, I don't know when it decides to actually crash versus say infinity, or sometimes in coding you see NaN with a capital N, a small a, and a capital N, and that stands for not a number. But so precondition here would be b not equal to 0. It's okay if a is equal to 0, but we're not allowed to divide by 0. Let's look at this, and you tell me if you can figure out what an appropriate precondition for this code would be. So first you have to figure out what this code's doing. Don't say it out loud, but see if you can figure out what an appropriate precondition would be. I guess first try to figure out what it's doing, because it is doing something. Just a sec. First, I want to know what this code is trying to do. So Quincy, what's this code trying to do?
It's trying to see how many times string 2 is in string 1.
Close, but not quite. Johan.
It's checking if string 1 starts with string 2.
Yeah, so what it's trying to do is it's checking if string 1 starts with string 2. Just so not how many times, but is string 2 literally the start of string 1? And Marcus, what would be a good precondition? String 1 longer than string 2, or same length?
Yeah.
String 1 length greater than or equal to? Oh, good. That's what I said. This is an interesting way to write it. 0 less than or equal to string 2 length less than or equal to string 1 length, meaning string, they could all be 0, or otherwise string 1 has to be the same length or longer. And so on the AP test and in various problems, you'll get problems that show you a precondition right above the method that you have to write, or they'll tell you about it. That's all we're doing here. So you've got 3 precondition problems on the AP classroom work we're going to do on Friday. So I just wanted to give this to you as a heads up before you had the problems and you're like, what's a precondition, Mr. Trice? They're basically saying what has to be true for this code to work. So, all right, now we've got sections 5.4 and 5.5. And I love these because they sound so scary, but there's 2 kinds of methods that there's many kinds of methods, but there's 2 types that we're talking about today. They're called accessor methods and mutator methods. And here's the little background. Java's designed from the ground up as an object-oriented programming environment, and classes are the objects, and Java lets the classes protect their internals. That's why we say private on the variables, because we don't want other people, other pieces of code just going in and changing the variables. If you had a fraction class, let's say, and you wanted to let people change the fraction, you'd want to control how they changed it, not just let them just put a piece of text in instead of the denominator. You'd want to have a little bit of control over what's going on, and that's why we mark the variables private. So here's an example of having some control in, we've used the rectangle class where it has a width and a height. This thing is called, this is a mutator method, and I'll define those really clearly in a second. It's trying to change the width of a rectangle that already exists. And notice it's doing a little check. It's saying, hey, if the width is greater than 0, then go ahead and set it to whatever they sent over. Can you see how that would be valuable? You wouldn't want to just let code accidentally or on purpose set the width of a rectangle to -20, because then it's not a rectangle in our known universe. It's like a made up thing. So this is an example. If you had the rectangle class and it was going to allow this method to happen, it's doing its own like internal checking. Whereas if you just had unfettered access to the variables, you could set it to anything, and it could crash. I made up a shirt class. This one, shirts can only be pink, red, or blue in this shirt class. And so when you're trying to set the color of a shirt to a new color, it's checking, hey, if it's pink, red, or blue, go for it. Otherwise, don't change it. And this is called data validation that you can do inside of a class. But it's just an example of why we would use accessor and mutator methods. So here we go. Accessor methods are sometimes called getter methods because they give you access to the private variables. They expose to you what they are, like get width, get height. Question? They're basically usually just return and then the variable name. They're just handing you the variable information because it's private. You can't access it directly, but you can call the method and you get it. A mutator method is also called a setter method because it sets information, changes information that's private. So here's an accessor method example up at top. Get width, return width. It's really that simple. So if that's a accessor method. A mutator method, I already gave you an example. This one doesn't have data validation, but you send over a new width and it sets it. So mutator methods are usually void. That's because they're usually just doing something to an object, to one of the variables. Accessor methods can't be void because they're giving you back something. That, by their definition, they have to have the right return type, whether it's an int or string or a Boolean or something else. Questions so far? So accessor and mutator methods allow us as the programmer to control who can see or mess around with our internals. So that's called encapsulation, because imagine you've encapsulated all your precious code inside of an object, and other people have you like publish, hey, here's what you can do to my object. If you were working on a team, you'd say, hey, I've got this rectangle class and you can do this, and this to it using these methods. And then other people would know, this is how, if I want to use Mr. Hayes' rectangle class, I'm limited to what he's asked me. Now, on a big project, you might have people, you design all this stuff ahead of time, but you could have people say, you know what, we've decided we need to add another method to the rectangle class that does X, Y, and Z. And then we all agree, and then you add it. It's not like these things are set in stone. But I have a little example here. Look up here. I'll try to make it as large as possible. I've made a rectangle. Here's the rectangle class, just what you've seen before. It's got a width and a height. The constructor makes a new, sets the variables. We've got get area, get width, and set width, and get height. So get width, is this an accessor or a mutator method? Accessor method, because it's just returning. Set width, accessor or mutator? Mutator. Mutate, it's mutating, it's changing the object. Get height, another accessor method. So up here, I don't know why this is over there, but I create a rectangle named R. I set the width to something else, and then I do all these things to it. Let's make sure it works. I wanted to show you. Yeah, so that all worked fine. But watch this. If I right here say R dot width equals 8, that would be okay if the variables down here were not private, but they are private. So when I try to run this code, Java's going to say, let's look at the error that it says. width has private access in rectangle. So I'm looking over here. Java line 8, width has private access in rectangle. And so it's saying you can't do this. You can't just pick one of these variables and then say, I'm going to set it. Now watch, if I get rid of this private, I might have to say public. I'm going to go ahead and say public. Then my code works. So you can just go ahead and other code can go ahead and just poke at things and do things. But for all the code you're going to write for me, we're going to have private variables at the top of our classes, and we're not ever going to do this. It's good to know that it's possible, but it's not something that a college board wants you to do either. It'd be pretty rare that you would be accessing variables that way. You'll have access to look at that example later. So we're almost done. Most of the time, there's just one more thing. Most of the time, we make all of our methods public, but sometimes you might have a method you only want to use inside of a class. A class can use its own methods inside. And so I'm giving you an example of that right here. I made a private method called setColor that's inside the shirt. And it does that checking, hey, make sure the shirt is either pink or blue, otherwise set it to pink. And so right here, when I make a new shirt, people send over whatever color they want, but I'm calling my internal, it's like a helper method, we can call it. It's doing the data validation over in this other spot. And that way, at the time that I use the constructor, I'm not having to have a bunch of complicated code in there. Anytime I wanted to add another color, I could change my set color method, but I wouldn't have to go change the constructor. So sometimes you can have private methods, and this is a case where you could do that. Just didn't want you to freak out if you saw a private method someday. Like, why is that private? Well, if it is private, though, it can only be called from inside of that class. You couldn't be like in the main method somewhere else, creating a shirt and then trying to call a private method. Okay, so now I'd like you to finish fractions and soda if you haven't already, and then we have a new, the last assignment for today is